I had to respond to a vehicle fire at 2 a.m. on a curvy road in a small town in Louisiana, about 45 minutes from an adequate hospital. They must have been going real fast because they went clean through a power line post and still got about 50 yards into the field. There were 3 patients and another unit already on scene. When we arrived, the paramedic on the other unit told us 2 of the patients were dead already and to help her with the patient they were dealing with. While we were prepping her to be airlifted, she kept asking where her daughter was. Around the same time, a cop came up to me and said one of the other patients was still breathing. When I saw him for the first time, he had 3rd-degree burns on 90% of his body. He crashed, so I started doing CPR. While doing compressions, his skin was just rubbing off underneath my hands. We got him back in rhythm somehow. When I went to grab his legs to put him on a spine board to be taken to a stretcher, his legs were so crispy fried that they felt like handfuls of gravel. As the firefighters started hauling him on the board to the stretcher, I noticed the 3rd patient still in the car. She had never been pulled out because she was DOA, but it was the first patient's daughter, I assume, because the only detail left to the body was how small it was. Got in the ambulance and was ready to transport the 2nd patient when the paramedic told me we weren't transporting because the doc told us not to. The 2nd patient was probably going to die anyway because of the burns. Overall, it was a huge shit show. We had a scene time of 2 hours, which is a huge no-no. The average is like 10 to 15 minutes. We had a supervisor come out to make sure all of the responders were all right. But I was cool because a cop gave me a Tootsie Pop. A small gesture like that turned the night around. I'll probably never forget the smell of that burned guy though. A family of 4 was in the car. The mom driving, the teenage daughter in the front seat, and the grandmother and 5-year-old son in the back. The mom was texting and driving and didn't notice a huge sweeping curve in the road. She went head-on, driver to driver, with a gravel hauler 18-wheeler, and neither of them had time to touch the brakes. My partner arrived a minute before me. The first thing I saw upon arrival was him, crying, carrying the lifeless 5-year-old boy away from the car, covered in all kinds of fluids. I approached what remained of the vehicle's passenger side and saw blood and brain matter everywhere. The mom was in pieces, her completely severed arm still trapped between the steering wheel and the hood. The grandmother was pinned behind her, with a broken back and neck, internally decapitated. Only the teenage daughter in the front seat survived, which is how we determined the mom was texting and driving. I've responded to a lot of gross and gruesome things, but this was easily the most disturbing. My daughter was the same age as the little boy, and I will never shake the image of his sad, lifeless body and my partner crying while carrying him away. Like others have said, things involving kids are generally harder to deal with. For fuck's sake, don't text and drive. Road crash rescue operator here. My pager went off while I was working at a mine. I took one look and read, "Major incident, child trapped 130 kilometers west highway." The guy I was working with probably read my face because he didn't say a word when I sprinted off. When traveling such large distances to incidents, your heart is in your throat. You always receive so little information about what you're about to witness, and seeing the word child in the initial call-out compounds your emotions. I remember sitting behind the wheel, willing the truck to go faster. It's likely the child had been trapped for hours by the time we arrived because it was such a remote area, and the police are notoriously slow at activating us, resulting in entrapments of 5 or 6 hours in some situations. When we arrived at the scene, it was complete chaos. The mother was catatonic and had to be sedated and taken away in an ambulance. The child's other siblings were terrified, and paramedics were in tears. We approached the vehicle and found the child pinned beneath the rear left wheel. His skull had been split open by the impact, and brain matter was thrown up to 45 meters from the scene. Interestingly, as soon as I witnessed that, I relaxed. I knew he was long gone before we arrived and had not been suffering. It took close to 18 hours before the road crash investigation team arrived. By that point, the poor kid was not smelling very nice. Human insides have a very distinctive smell, which anyone familiar with it will understand, compounded by Australian heat and mixing with the smell of groceries that had split open up the highway. The car was full from a shopping trip, which is not unusual for remote properties where people only shop a few times a year and return home with huge loads of food. It was determined that the child was in a booster seat in the back and was playing up, taking his arms out of the straps. The mother, who was behind the wheel, turned around to scold him, lost control of the vehicle, which tumbled down the highway, flinging the child out. By a cruel twist of fate, the car landed back on top of him. The father lived on a remote property approximately 150 kilometers from the accident scene. He left his house with a full tank of fuel in his XR6, and it was empty upon his arrival at the scene. One can imagine the speed he was traveling at. It didn't hit me until the following morning when we were sweeping up the remains on the road to clear the highway after being given the all-clear. I recall there being a large volume of toddlers' clothes strewn up the road. I picked them up and threw them off to the side, thinking, well, the family won't be needing these. I have attended many grisly road crash incidents, but that one sticks. It was my first fatality, and I learned a lot about the resilience of human skin while simultaneously learning about the fragility of humans as a whole. The smell still sticks with me. Being a paramedic, I have seen my fair share of blood, gore, dead bodies, etc. Most of it doesn't bother me. I'm kinda numb to it now. I still hate seeing bad calls involving kids. The parents' screams are probably the worst. But another big thing I hate is just bad smells and shit. One of the worst bad smells calls I had was for this guy who sideswiped a bunch of cars. The cops found him and pulled the dude over, but when they were talking to him, they noticed his foot was all bloody, so they called us out. When we got there, we started assessing the guy and realized that he was missing a toe and half of another one. He had an infection that went untreated, and he was losing parts of his toes. The smell was absolutely horrible. The grossest call involving shit was a homeless guy who was covered in his own shit. At least I hope it was his own. He had been shitting himself for so long that a lot of it was already dry and caked onto him and his clothes. As you can guess, the smell was bad also. It's around 11:30 p.m., and we get a call for a pregnant lady experiencing cramps and vaginal bleeding. We get on scene and find this lady standing in her driveway, shaking, pale, and altered. She wouldn't answer my questions, and no one else was around. I figured she had lost a lot of blood, so once we got her in the ambulance, I used a Doppler to listen for fetal heart tones. Nothing. I told my partner that I was going to check inside to see if anybody else was there. So I grabbed the flashlight and headed towards the open garage. I noticed a lot of blood trailing inside, so I followed it, turning on house lights as I went. It led me through the garage, the kitchen, the living room, and into the bathroom where the only light in the house was already on. I called out, "Paramedics! Anyone here?" No answer. I opened the bathroom door and noted the blood trailing towards the toilet. Right next to the toilet was an aborted, 28 to 32-week fetus. It was gross, smelled horrible, and I suddenly felt really freaked out. I remembered that mothers tend to still require bonding time with their child after a miscarriage, so I picked the baby up and put the body in a bag, then returned to the ambulance. Once inside, my partner had started fluids on the patient, and I told him what I found. We decided to just hit the road and get her to the hospital. She didn't say anything for a while. Finally, the mom looked at me and simply and quietly asked if she could have her baby. I said, "Of course," and handed her the dead fetus, which is still in the bag. She teared up and held it tight for the rest of the trip. I just sat there quietly observing her vitals and holding her hand. UK paramedic here. A few years ago, I went to a call that seemed run-of-the-mill. I arrived at the house to be greeted by a 45 to 50 stone woman, feeling generally horrible. The stench was horrendous. There was rotten food everywhere, animal shit everywhere, and she hadn't moved off this bed in years. The bed had mostly collapsed and rotted away as she had just been defecating where she lay. Her fat had grown around the springs, causing wounds that had no chance to heal, so her entire backside was rotting away. She died in the end from a severe septic infection. We attempted to get her out of the bed with the help of the fire service and a few doctors for enhanced support, but we couldn't. Our plan was to take the wall out of the house and take the bed with her, but we had no way of transporting her like that and no hospital that could house something like that. So in the end, There was a team of hospital staff at her house until she died, which was only a few days later. I burned my uniform after that. No amount of washing was going to get that clean. Long-time medic here. The most disgusting thing in recent memory happened about 2 years ago. I was running 911 for a city in the Midwest. The call came in as an obstetrics and gynecology complaint. We started rolling to the call, and my radio pings. Dispatch to Medic 25. 25, go ahead. We have further information on your call from PD on scene. PD were usually always with us on calls. Go ahead with further. Dispatch. 25. You're being dispatched on a burned vagina. Come back on your last? I didn't copy. I honestly thought I misheard them or something. Negative 25, you copied. I just laughed and said, 25 continuing to call. We got on scene at a trailer park. I'd been here for the umpteenth time this week. Lower socioeconomic class and lots of narcotics ran through here. I walked into the trailer. It was very well kept and clean, minus the cigarette smoke. There was a young girl around 17 sitting in a chair. She was wearing no pants or underwear, with only a damp washcloth on her groin. Her parents were next to her. I said to her, "My name is X and I'm a medic with the city FD. What happened?" She paused and said, "Well, take a look." So I peeled off the washcloth and was immediately revolted. Her vagina looked awful. There was a strong chemical smell, small amounts of blood on and around it. Her hair was patchy, and there was what looked like pus. I said, "Jesus, what happened?" She said, "My boyfriend gave me crabs." To which I replied, "Ma'am, crabs do not do this to you." She said, "I know, but I didn't want my parents to know, so I couldn't go to a doctor. So I sprayed Raid on it." I was stunned. All I could muster up was, "The ant killer stuff? That Raid." She said, "No, I think it was the wasp stuff." My dad responded to 2 calls in 2 days that caused him to quit his job as a paramedic and completely change careers after a lengthy inpatient stay due to psychological trauma. The first was a house fire with a preteen girl trapped inside. All the windows were barred and the firefighters couldn't get them off fast enough. So they all watched the girl be burned to death standing in a window frame against the bars. The second was a baby girl who had been raped by an adult man. Her genitals were unrecognizable. While the police were arresting the man, my dad attacked him and all but pulverized the guy's face before the officers pulled him away. This was back when I was still on placement for becoming a paramedic. We received a call to check on the welfare of someone in a sketchy hotel or low-income building due to a funny smell coming from the room. We arrived at the dodgy apartment and headed upstairs with the little Chinese landlord. As we walked down the hall, the smell hit us, the unmistakable stench of rotting flesh. Upon reaching the room, the landlord unlocked the door, but it wouldn't budge. He had to body check the door open. We noticed knives jammed in the doorframe, which raised our suspicions even more. Deciding it was best to wait for the police before entering, we waited. But curiosity got the better of us. We could see the bathroom right next to the entrance with the tap running. My partner and I said, "Screw it, let's check it out." We entered the apartment and found drug paraphernalia everywhere. Heading into the bathroom, we discovered the source of the running water and an unimaginable sight. There was a lady in the bathroom, her skin green like the Hulk, bloated, and clearly in an advanced state of decomposition. The smell of death was overpowering. It was undoubtedly one of the most memorable and disgusting calls I've ever been on. My son-in-law, who worked as a 911 dispatch coordinator, shared a particularly devastating call he received one summer day. A father had purchased a commercial zero-turn lawnmower to maintain a large area of land. He started mowing from the far side of the lot and was gradually working his way toward the house. Tragically, his 5-year-old daughter ran excitedly toward her daddy through the high weeds. Unaware of her presence, the father turned at the end of the lot and accidentally knocked the girl down, running over her with the mower. The incident shook the entire community, involving the state police, fire department, sheriff's department, EMS, and everyone who heard about it. The young father and mother never fully recovered from the tragedy. As a paramedic, I responded to a call involving a middle-aged mentally challenged woman who lived with other mentally challenged roommates. She had injured her knee a few months prior to our call, and the pain from the injury was so severe that she had not moved from her couch in nearly 4 months. During this time, she had urinated, defecated, and even menstruated on the couch without getting up. Her roommates continued to care for her, providing food and assistance as needed, but she remained immobile for 4 months. The situation became unbearable due to the overwhelming smell, prompting her roommates to finally call for help. When we arrived and attempted to move her from the couch, the stench was so intense that some of the more experienced firefighters outside couldn't help but vomit. Upon examination, we discovered that she had developed necrotizing fasciitis from her buttocks to the back of her knee, where she had been immobile and incontinent for months. When we helped her stand up, the odor of feces, urine, and decay was so overpowering that it was difficult to remain composed. Ultimately, she required amputation of at least one of her legs, as the tissue had deteriorated to the point where her femur was visible, and the rest of her tissue had either decayed or turned black. EMT here. Here's a trauma call from when I was a basic student. We got a call for an MVC, and upon arrival we saw a motorcyclist who had hit a parked car. The motorcycle was wedged into the front of the car, practically through the engine block. The patient was unconscious but miraculously still alive, despite not wearing a helmet. He was agonal gasping, with deviated and unreactive eyes, and I was primarily concerned about his head and neck. Half of his scalp was avulsed, and he had a depressed skull fracture. The increased intracranial pressure caused him to bite off his own tongue, compromising his airway. We had to pry his mouth open to suction the blood and insert an OPA. The entire transport involved bagging and dumping fluids. By this point, his lungs were shot. When we left the ER, he had chest tubes on both sides, one of which was profusely draining blood. Remarkably, the guy ended up walking out of the hospital. Definitely a lucky man compared to most stories like this. Please, wear a helmet when you're riding a motorcycle. Also, stop with the wheelies and tricks. Number 1, you don't look as cool as you think. Number 2, you'll end up killing yourself or someone else in the process. I wanted to share this story because there's a crucial lesson to be learned from it. I was lucky enough not to respond to this call myself, but my FTO did. A husband and wife were at home cooking when the wife accidentally dumped boiling water all over her lap. The husband panicked, threw her into his truck, and sped towards the hospital. He was going approximately 80 miles per hour in a 50 miles per hour zone late at night. As he crested a small hill, the truck left the pavement slightly, causing him to swerve. Unable to brake, he slammed into the back of a dump truck attempting to make a turn. The wife died instantly, her head caved in by the corner of the dump truck's bumper. I saw the wreckage of their truck in our impound yard every day as we investigated the incident. The husband was charged with manslaughter. On top of dealing with the immense guilt of his wife's death, he was an emotional wreck. The moral of the story: never attempt to drive someone to the hospital like that unless it is a matter of imminent life or death. Call an ambulance. First responders are trained to drive at high speeds and can stabilize a patient on the way. I have been a paramedic for over 16 years and have been witness to some truly horrifying calls. Fires that have destroyed families, motor vehicle accidents where no one gets to go home. But one call haunts me still after 15 years. I'm actually tearing up a little writing this. We got dispatched to a firearm accident with little details. My friend has been shot. When we got there, we found that the caller had committed suicide and wanted us to be the ones who found him instead of his parents and family. It was very unfortunate, and I wished we could have gotten there before he pulled the trigger and prevented the needless death. But unfortunately, we couldn't. Here is where things went south. He left voicemails for his parents, thinking they wouldn't get them until the end of the working day. But his mom got hers early and came home minutes after we got there. Hearing her cries of pain and sorrow totally sucks to this day. 15 years later. I still remember everyone's name, where they live, what he was wearing, the layout of the house. I'm putting the phone down now and going to hug my kids and play with them. Looking back over a long career in both the military and civilian world, I've become quite numb to most things. The calls that have to do with children, however, always stick with me. The worst call involved a child who had been beaten to death by an abusive, drugged-out parent. When we arrived on the scene, I pulled the child out of the bed they were in to start treatment. As I grabbed the pillow to throw it out of the way, I noticed a wet spot on it. It was where the child had buried their face during the abuse. The tears were still warm. The child was dead. There was nothing we could do to change that. Just moments earlier, the child had been crying. Not enough time had passed for the tears to even cool. I couldn't fix it, though. Those warm tears haunt me still. When I was still a student, I was training at the Old Womack Army Hospital at Footbragg. It had just started raining when we received a call about a car accident. On scene, we found a lady who had lost control of her Mustang and hit a tree. The impact was so severe that the car wrapped around the tree, almost touching it. I didn't think such a thing was possible and only happened in cartoons. She was pinned against the passenger side door, barely conscious and in pain. The fire department had to extricate her. As soon as the pressure of her entrapment was released, she lost consciousness and coded right there. It was a load and go situation, straight to the ER. She was worked on for 40 minutes en route and at the ER. The trauma surgeon finally came down and opened her up, only to find a ruptured inferior vena cava. It was essentially an unsurvivable injury, and the decision was made to call it right there. I guess because I was so young and a student, and had never seen anything like that before, it really made the call stick with me. Going back a couple of years to when I first started as an EMT, a call came in for a car crash, and we sprang into action. Arriving at the scene, it was a grim sight. What had happened was a car had been speeding through a school zone, and as another car was pulling out, they didn't have time to avoid a collision. The speeding car T-boned the other vehicle. Tragically, 3 occupants in the speeding car weren't wearing their seatbelts and were ejected from the cab upon impact, resulting in devastating injuries. The visual was harrowing. They appeared as little more than hamburger meat strewn across the ground. However, one individual who had been wearing a seatbelt had the belt cut through his body and wrap around his spine. Miraculously, he managed to survive, perhaps with a stroke of luck or divine intervention. The other vehicle involved in the crash carried 3 passengers, a young girl and her family. The impact zone was merciless. The girl and her mother were crushed and died instantly, while the father suffered severe injuries to the entire right side of his body and passed away on the way to the hospital. I have a few stories to share. On Mother's Day 2016, a tragic incident unfolded when a young mother pulled out in front of a state trooper speeding at 80 miles per hour, resulting in internal decapitation. We worked tirelessly to extricate her from the wreckage, but the sight of the little car seats in the back served as a stark reminder that her children would never see their mother again. Shortly thereafter, we received another call involving a vehicle collision with a pole, where a second young mother was so severely injured that I could feel organs through her chest. It was evident there was no chance of survival, and we made the difficult decision to call it on scene. Christmas 2008 brought a different kind of heartache. We responded to a call for a man in his 30s with pancreatic cancer, spending his final days at home next to the Christmas tree. His wife greeted us at the door, armed with power of attorney papers and DNR forms, fully aware that he was going to the hospital to pass away. The sound of her anguished cries from the other room as we prepared to transport him was haunting. In a departure from protocol, I allowed her to accompany her husband in the back, where she held his hand and offered words of comfort as he slipped away before we could complete the paperwork. There are moments in this profession that cut deeply. One such instance was when we responded to a call for a grandfather who collapsed on the last day of his visit with his children. As we administered CPR, I couldn't help but notice the familiarity of the shoes protruding from under the couch, a reminder of my own daughter's affection for her grandfather. Finally, on Christmas Day night in 2012, We were called to assist a woman who initially appeared to have flu-like symptoms. As we conversed about our children and shared stories, she suddenly went into cardiac arrest due to a viral heart illness. We worked tirelessly for 2 hours, but despite our efforts, we were unable to save her, experiencing the heartbreak of losing her multiple times throughout the ordeal. EMT here. I can't discuss the details too much, but this incident still haunts me. I was working part-time at another facility where a fellow was using a massive industrial forklift to move huge steel plates. The payload must have been several tons. Somehow, the poor guy got in between the payload and a concrete wall when the parking brakes on the forklift malfunctioned. I didn't see the event happen firsthand, but the man was pinned against the wall by several tons of sharp plates crushing his abdomen. They made it quite a ways in. Unfortunately, I was the only medically trained person on scene. It ended up taking nearly 20 minutes for ALS, advanced life support, to arrive while I did everything I could. Those 20 minutes felt like an eternity, knowing he was in excruciating pain and there was only so much I could do to help. It's one of those calls that sticks with you, reminding you of the immense responsibility and the limits of our abilities in such critical situations.